Hey guys! Welcome to a new episode of my crypto gaming journey, and today I want to do a recap of my Illuvium strategy in order to set the stage for their massive update. Survival mode is going through an overhaul, marking the transition to Private Beta 2 phase, with the addition of new units, bonds, augments, as well as new mechanics. I will go over what I learned playing Private Beta 1 and what tips and tricks I employed on my way to the infamous Wave 30, managing to defeat Survival mode. As I mentioned in my previous video, each day had a new rotation of Illuvials, so you still need to adapt to each setup and change your lineup. However, I believe that there are some general principles that apply in any scenario. First and foremost, during the initial waves you can pretty much pick whatever Illuvial you like best, and I went for Scoriox as it was the most versatile and had the highest DPS. I also equipped my ranger with the air-bladed shield and a hybrid jumpsuit, in order to tank any threat and keep Scoriox safe. Up until wave 7 I used any remainder of mastery points on random Illuvials, my second favorite being Replants as his Omega ability deals percentage health damage, basically chewing through enemy tanks. I was fortunate enough to also have two Granite Illuvials in the deck, TNT and Titanor. The reason why is because the 2-point bonus for Granite grants immunity for 4 seconds in the beginning of the fight. At level 7 I had enough mastery points to afford the TNT Titanor combo, which meant having both the best tank as well as a damage bonus for Scoriox. One of the most important aspects of Illuvium's auto battle that you need to understand in order to be successful is how positioning and targeting work. In the beginning of the fight, Illuvials automatically target the closest enemy and focus on it until either one of them dies or another effect triggers a change of focus. The only exception is rogues, which first teleport behind enemy lines and then fixate on the closest enemy. There are two main effects that cause a change of focus: teleportation and the Omega ability of the 3 Kuka birds. In the first case, if an Illuvial's target teleports or even burrows underground, that Illuvial will refocus on the next closest target. Secondly, Kuka's Omega ability stuns the closest target and causes it to become the primary focus for Kuka's allies, while also taking additional damage for the duration of the stun. Another advantage of properly positioning your units is that you can trigger their hyper state more quickly. I talked about affinities in my previous video and how they counter each other. Basically, the more units an Illuvial counters in a 50 hexagon radius, the faster it gains hyper. However, facing a net negative sum of enemy counters in that radius can also cause the hyper counter to go down for that specific Illuvial. This applies only until that Illuvial gains hyper because it persists for the remainder of the round. This mechanic adds a ton of complexity and it is quite difficult to master, but can make a huge difference in later waves. You can tell which Illuvials gain hyper by the yellow bar filling up to the left of their nameplate. Hyper Illuvials gain 25% attack speed and additional bonuses depending on their role. There was an obvious board asymmetry with two powerful rogues and an off-tank on the left side which I couldn't reliably focus down, so I decided to let my Titanor soak their hits until I handled the leftovers on the much weaker right hand side. I put all of my damage dealers as far away as possible from Titanor because Ramfire's Omega has a huge radius, and I didn't want it to hit any other targets apart from Titanor. I am primarily placing Titanor against more enemies and secondarily as close as possible to my main damage dealers, as they need to have a sustainable tank so that they don't get focused. When using a heavy tank setup you need to pay attention to a couple of potential threats: Replants, which deals percentage health damage, and Kuka, which stuns and increases damage taken by the target. Even though there were both Replants and Ripter that dealt percentage health damage, I had to place Titanor to tank them as the right hand side was way too powerful to be handled by the ranger. There was also a Kukaraf which could have spelled disaster for my Titanor, so I used the Vermilier to specifically target it. Once again an asymmetric board with a lot of threats on the left side, so I had to place my Titanor to handle them, while Vermilier dove for the Kukaraf. Important to note how dangerous a Ramfire Omega can be, especially when targeting multiple units. In addition, a Sea Elf left unchecked can wreak havoc as the fight goes on. This is quite a tricky setup as you can either focus down the enemy Titanor to prevent him from becoming hyper, or you can deal as quickly as possible with the rest of the enemies. I went for the latter as there was also an off-tank in close proximity to the enemy Titanor, and that could have slowed my damage dealers. During this wave I also introduced a Dorios and I used him to off-tank the enemy Malura. Apart from keeping Malura away from my damage dealers, Adorius also gained a lot of energy points from being attacked, so he could use his Omega ability more frequently. You can see how effective Kukas are against tanks. This wave presented a very crowded left side where it was difficult to predict the order of the enemies being taken down, so I decided to flank them from the right. I always try to distract enemy Vermilier with my ranger, as the airbladed shield also stuns the target, often delaying an Omega ability. Once again, my Adorius handled the enemy Umbre without any problems, and I pointed my Vermilier against the enemy Synelf. Some players prefer focusing down enemy rogues as quickly as possible, and that is either by placing the main damage dealers closer to them or by using a Kuka. I am not such a big fan of this, but it might become obligatory when you don't have a Titan or in the deck. This wave was abundant in science, and I focused my damage dealers and Titan on the left side where they were more exposed. I also replaced my Vermilier with another tank, Seer, to easily handle the enemy Ramfire, and I used my Adorius as distraction for the enemy Dual F's Omega. Important to note that when being hit, Illuvials also charge their Omega faster. This means, for example, that using Adorius as I described earlier allows him to cast more Omegas. The same observation explains why I try to avoid attacking the enemy Adorius if I encounter one. This board might seem equally crowded on both sides, but know that the enemy Ramfire and Malura instantly teleport, so in reality the right hand side was more exposed. I chose to ignore the enemy Sephorus, which can be dangerous as his Omega fires at random targets, but my damage dealers dealt with Ramfire and Malura quite quickly. Against Ramfire you can also use Replants, as it usually handles the problem without any issues. Once you get to wave 20 and upwards, you should be able to pick the top 8 Illuvials from the deck, so it is strictly a matter of adjusting positions or minor changes to the roster. As far as healers are concerned, I personally prefer Adoredo, the tier 2 variant, as it combines a bit of survivability with faster charging Omega. However, if you get Adorius, the tier 3 variant, his higher health pool allows him to act as an off-tank, being able to sustain hits from a rogue or even from a Dual F Omega. Here I chose to ignore the Synelf and focus on Replants and Sephorus as quickly as possible. I did have to face 4 rogues, so I kept my Seer, which also became hyper, so he managed to beat the enemy Vermilier. In the end it was quite a close call, but Adorius and Scoriox pulled it off. By far my main targets were Psions, especially Scoriox, followed by Sephorus and Dualef. In that sense, if you encounter multiple threats hidden deep behind enemy lines, it is best to adapt your comp a little and use 1 or 2 rogues. The general favorite one is Ramfire, but I feel like his Omega ability charges too slowly. Therefore, I tend to go with Vermilier and Umbre. The former has a heavy hitting Omega that usually finishes off the target, and if not, silences it, while the latter has an extremely high attack speed. I decided to pull both Titanor and Ramfire with my Ranger, and you will see how annoying Titanor is in the late game, especially when paired with an Adorius. However, I didn't want to focus my attention on the right hand side, as there are also Kukarov and Adorius, leaving the enemy Synelf unchecked, nuking down my team. You will also notice how powerful Seer's Omega is, especially against multiple targets. You will notice that in most rounds I have 2 tanks, Titanor and a Ranger. Important to note that if you face multiple rogues spread all over the map, you might need to get a 3rd or even a 4th tank, for example Singe or Seer, to spread the damage over multiple allies. In this case, I would ideally let them tank easier targets so that they survive and unleash their spinning Omega on multiple targets after refocusing. This wave had so many threats, so I had to split them up in order to buy more time for my damage dealers. I used my Adorius, Seer and the Ranger as distraction while sending Umbre to hunt down Kukarov. A particular aspect that I encountered on multiple occasions is that due to mastery point constraints, the most difficult part of the survival mode is actually waves 14 to 19. The reason behind this is that you don't have enough mastery points to get the ideal setup of 8 Illuvials, so you have to make a difficult choice, especially as waves get much tougher. I chose to ignore the enemy Adorius even if he was in the front line, because I didn't want to leave the enemy Dual F unattended. I also traded my Seer for Ramfire and Flare because I didn't need so many powerful tanks, but I wanted to finish off the enemy backline more quickly. Also notice a positioning error on my side as the enemy Vermilior's Omega hits both my Ranger and my Skoriox. This is because it is a frontal cone and not a single target ability. I wanted to avoid committing too much to the enemy replants and Seer frontline, so I decided to go for more rogues, while the range damage dealers took them off one by one. I targeted Dualev first, followed by Sinalf, while my Titanor managed to survive long enough so that my Skoriox and TNT could finish off replants and Kukaraf. As I mentioned in my previous video, higher tier Illuvials fill up their Omega slower, so in this example, the enemy Kukaraf didn't get a chance to use the stun on my Titanor. This was an easy call as whenever a Skoriox is in the front line, he is the primary target, not to mention the lack of a strong front line that made this wave quite easy. However, my rogues went for the enemy Adorius too early and they kept fueling his Omegas, which proved to be quite annoying. The main challenge proved to be the fact that the enemy team had two healers, Adorius and Adoredo, each having different rates of filling their Omega energy. As a result, this ensured a constant stream of healing for the enemy team, making killing them more difficult. There was not very much maneuvering in this wave, so I just had to point my rogues towards the enemy Kukas in order to take them down as quickly as possible. In this case, I had no other option but to focus the enemy Adorius with all of my units. I figured that if Adorius was the main target, his healing would not be that effective for his allies. However, notice how quickly Adorius fills up his energy bar and uses his Omega. This is all due to how energy works and the fact that each attack causes extra energy points to stack, similarly to how Rage works in World of Warcraft, for example. Again, pretty straightforward as there were both a Skoriox and a Firiox in the front line on the right hand side, so that's where my team went. Rogues were assigned to the enemy Kukaraf while Adorius and the Ranger tanked the enemy rogues. Unfortunately, my Flare didn't pick up the enemy Umbra and my Adorius had two rogues targeting him, which, coupled with the stun from the enemy Titanor's Omega, resulted in his timely death. However, my damage dealers had plenty of time to finish off the enemy threat, so overall it was quite a straightforward wave. Apart from a Seer, the enemy team had almost no frontline, so I just went for Firiox and replants first. Even though the enemy team had no significant threats in the backline, I kept my Umbra and Ramfire and they pretty much carried the fight. Take a look at how savage a Hyper Ramfire can become and how he was attacking like a machine gun. Each attack added more energy, so he also used his Omega twice in this round. I want to remind you that Adorius, as well as his lower tier variants, heal for a percentage of the target's health pool, so imagine the support they offer for their frontline. Dualev and Kukaraf in the front line meant once again a simple decision. Unfortunately, my Ranger didn't pick the enemy Vermilior after the teleport, so my Adorius went down quite easily. However, I did trade in a replants which tore apart the enemy rogues. This time I had 4 Illuvials that got Hyper, Ramfire, Titanor, Skoriox and TNT, so it is safe to say that positioning worked, making this wave trivial. Very weak left side and stacked with Psyan, so I couldn't ignore this opportunity while my rogues went for their scattered backline. The enemy Dualev did hit some stacked targets, but Adorius kept the Omega healing rolling. This time my ranged damage dealers finished off the enemy rogues after the first refocus, as the rest of the enemy team was farther away from them. This goes to show that this tactic can work as well, especially when there aren't many AoE damage dealers. After the enemy rogues vanished, there was a Skoriox that had to be taken down. Once again I used the replants to make quick work of the enemy Ramfire as I ran out of tanks for all of their rogues. Unfortunately, after taking down the enemy Kuka, my Ramfire went for the enemy Adorius, which allowed him to cast more Omegas once again. However, the enemy rogues had no real support in my backline, so my Skoriox and TNT disposed of them quickly. The final wave was obviously a mess from my part as I ignored their rogues while focusing on their tanks. This took too long, so I ended up facing some enemy units that got hyper, most notably Malura. In retrospect, I should have bulked my team on the right hand side and ignored the enemy tanks until later into the fight. Once again, replans proved to be no match for Ramfire. The very last wave ended with my Hyper Scoriox going head to head against the enemy Hyper Malura, and I must have won by a couple of hit points. I am looking forward to the Private Beta 2 update, and I can't wait to share with all of you my impressions and strategies. Until then, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching!